Stardom for Week 13. I'm your host, Josh Shepardson, and you can follow me on Twitter where I post this at BChat50. And this week's sit-ems is going to start with a elite quarterback that I'm advocating gluing to your bench. Probably not really a shocker for many, but I would not use Philip Rivers this week against the Denver Broncos. They are by far the best pass defense in the league. They are the only pass defense in the league allowing fewer than 200 yards passing per game to quarterbacks. And as good as Rivers is, and believe me, he's great. He's leading the league in attempts per game, or passing attempts, and he's been excellent this year. He just doesn't have the weapons to take advantage of, well, not even take advantage of, but to post numbers against this Broncos secondary that's loaded. TJ Ward is unlikely to play at safety, but the corners are just super talented for the Broncos. And guys like Stevie Johnson, Malcolm Floyd, Dontrell Inman, they're not talented enough to shake that kind of coverage. If he still had Keenan Allen, I might be leaning towards starting him as a low-end QB1, but he obviously doesn't. The best way to beat the Broncos through the air is with tight ends, so there is that argument for Rivers, but certainly not enough to get him in a lineup for me this week. Not when you've got other streaming options that are available, namely the guy that I'm going to highlight a little bit later in the podcast. But you've got guys with better matchups. I'd actually use the quarterback opposing him, Brock Osweiler, before I'd use Philip Rivers this week, just for an example. Moving on to running back, I would not start Frank Gore this week. I know there's a lack of starting running backs, there's a lack of feature backs, there's a lack of talent at the position right now with all of the injuries sustained. I get it. I know there are not a lot of options just lying around on the waiver wire. Benches are pretty thin with options now, but Gore's been terrible lately. He's not played well with Matt Hasselbeck as the quarterback, especially the last 2 weeks when he's rushed for just 58 yards on 33 carries. He has complemented that with 7 receptions for 59 receiving yards, but all in all, that's under 60 yards from scrimmage in each of those averaging under 60 yards from scrimmage in those 2 contests, and no touchdowns. So not really doing a lot. And the Steelers' run defense is absolutely excellent, at least from a fantasy perspective. They're allowing the second fewest fantasy points to running backs this year, so it's an awful, awful matchup. Even with the high total of 48 points in that game, don't expect Frank Gore to find the end zone. The Steelers have allowed just 3 rushing touchdowns to running backs this year, so really dreadful matchup for Frank Gore. Not likely to get a touchdown to save his day, not likely to put up much in terms of yardage. Might catch a few passes, which would obviously help him in PPR leagues, but he just has an awful matchup and hasn't been playing well. I think you can certainly do better, even if you have to go to a guy like Theo Riddick in PPR leagues, or even in standard scoring formats. If you're watching this before the Thursday night contest, I would use Amir Abdullah. I would use Theo Riddick in front of Frank Gore, as well as a number of others who are playing on Sunday, again, including the back that I'm going to highlight, or maybe perhaps backs that I'm going to highlight in the stardom section of the podcast. Next up, as a sit-em, going to include Stefon Diggs, and it really feels like this is a week for sitting guys who played well this year, guys who have been starters week in and week out. Rivers has been. Gore's had moments this year. Diggs played really well to open up the season when he was finally active for the Minnesota Vikings, but he's been scuffling of late. He has not bested 60 yards receiving. He's bested 60 yards receiving, just once in his last 4 games. Hasn't reached the end zone in any of those contests. And in case you were snoozing through last week's games, Richard Sherman shut down Antonio Brown, held him to 6 receptions for 51 yards. As good as Diggs is, he's certainly not in the conversation with Antonio Brown. Brown's arguably the best receiver in the league. Doesn't mean that Richard Sherman's going to shadow Stefon Diggs, but it's certainly a possibility when really there aren't any other receiving threats at receiver anyway. For the Minnesota Vikings, Kyle Rudolph has been emerging as an option, and you'd expect that Teddy Bridgewater will target him frequently since the Seahawks have struggled with tight ends this year. That further buries Stefon Diggs, especially when you know this is a team that's going to run the ball with Adrian Peterson. So I just don't see The juice isn't worth the squeeze, basically. Diggs just not worth starting this week in a really tough matchup. Next up is Benjamin Watson of the New Orleans Saints. He's not a guy that'll be in my starting lineups this week. Tough matchup. Watson's been a surprise performer this year, averaging almost 55 yards receiving per game, has 3 touchdown grabs, 4.5 receptions per game. He's really become one of Drew Brees' favorite targets, but the Carolina Panthers have been awesome against the pass this year. Granted, a great deal of that has to do with Josh Norman shutting down #1 receivers and the ability of them to just take receivers out of the game. But they are allowing the 12th fewest fantasy points to tight ends this year, and Football Outsiders is really impressed with their work, grading the Panthers second defending tight ends this year. So really tough draw for Ben Watson. Drew Brees is excellent at home, but this is a really bad matchup, and I just don't see Ben Watson as a top 12 option at tight end this week, especially when you've got widely available guys like Scott Chandler, Cameron, well, less widely available than earlier in the week, but Scott Chandler is an injury fill-in for Rob Gronkowski. Cameron Brate is a guy that I highlighted in the streaming and waiver wire article and podcast this week. I like him, and got one more starting option for you that might be considered a fringe guy that I would take over Ben Watson, and I'll be getting to him shortly. Moving on to the good news of the podcast, and that is that if you have Kirk Cousins, you're probably going to like it if you start him this week. He has been lights out at home, completing 74.75% of his passage, averaging 8.24 yards per pass attempt, 272 yards passing per game, 11 touchdowns at home passing, just a pair of interceptions, and has added 3 rushing touchdowns just for good measure. Really love what Kirk Cousins is doing when he's at home. The Cowboys have been stingy with giving up fantasy points to quarterbacks this year, but not in a good situation this week. Probably going to be putting some compromised short field situations with Matt Castle back under center. Castle back capable of turning the ball over, incapable of moving the offense. So I expect the Washington Redskins to be working with some short fields this week and really putting the Dallas Cowboys defense to the test. And with Cousins playing the way that he is at home, that makes him a top 10 quarterback for me this week. Next up is C.J. Anderson of the Denver Broncos facing the San Diego Chargers. And I will add that not only would I start Anderson, I would also start Ronnie Hillman this week. The Chargers are the worst run defense in football. They grade out last according to Football Outsiders. They're giving up the most fantasy points per game to running backs this year. They're giving up yardage. They're giving up receptions. They're giving up touchdowns. Everything you could ask for from running backs is being given to them. They're getting the red carpet rolled out by the San Diego Chargers this year. There's nothing super about these Chargers. They cannot stop running backs. With Brock Osweiler under center for the Broncos, literally under center, this offense has really gotten the running game going. And since the bye week in Week 7 for the Broncos, C.J. Anderson has rushed for 316 yards on 50 carries, good for 6.12 yards per carry, and 3 rushing scores. Last week, he was especially impressive, rushing for 113 yards, 2 touchdowns, and adding 40 yards on 4 receptions. He's proven to be the better pass-catching back than Hillman. He's the bigger back, and you'd expect him to get the goal line work. That said, both look like startable options this week because Hillman is also getting work in the running game, and he's just a week removed from rushing for 100 yards himself. Anderson looks like an RB2 to me. Hillman looks like a flex option, so I would start both backs this week and expect them to pile up some numbers against the Chargers defense that just has had no answer for running backs this year. Speaking of a guy coming off a good week, Dante Moncrief gets the nod as a start at wide receiver for me. Had a big showing against the Bucs last week, catching 8 passes for 114 yards receiving. Might have been slightly overshadowed if you were just box score glancing or watching the Red Zone channel or things of that nature, because T.Y. Hilton found the end zone twice last week, but Moncrief went over 100 yards receiving, led the team in receiving yards, caught 8 of 9 targets, so he was efficient, and got to like that target number of 9. With Matt Hasselbeck playing quarterback this year, he's been targeted 36 times in 5 games, but I have to remember that his low output came in a 3-target, 1 reception for 4 receiving yards game against the Houston Texans on a Thursday night, and that was a game that Matt Hasselbeck was ill, very ill. He was in the hospital earlier in the week. There was a thought that he might not be able to complete the game. So the fact that Moncrief had a bad showing in that game, probably not entirely his fault. They also did seem to game plan to get Andre Johnson the football against his former team. Basically, Andre Johnson's only meaningful game of the season. He's played like trash all year. But throw out that contest, and Moncrief is averaging 8.25 targets per contest with Matt Hasselbeck at quarterback. And that kind of volume against the Steelers has a chance to pay big dividends. They are allowing a ton of fantasy scoring to wide receivers, and they just gave up 5 receiving touchdowns to wideouts for the Seahawks, 3 to Doug Baldwin, 2 to Jermaine Kearse last week. And I would argue Moncrief might be a better receiver than both. Probably debatable with Baldwin. Baldwin's playing at a high level right now. Might be something of a hot take to suggest that Dante Moncrief's better, but bigger receiver, more physical, and ultimately, the fact that it's a conversation means that he should have a little problem beating up on the secondary, whether he draws Ross Cockrell or one of the other cornerbacks. Cockrell, the best cornerback on that team, still ranks just 53rd among corners, according to Pro Football Focus. So really a plus matchup for him. Finally, at tight end, going to another tight end option beyond my streaming suggestion of Cameron Brate. I want to give you multiple options this week. So I decided to highlight Vance McDonald as another guy who is startable. Back end, low end, fringe, tight end 1. Basically, he's emerged with Blaine Gabbert under center for the San Francisco 49ers. Gabbert started 3 games. In Gabbert's first start, Vance McDonald was fairly quiet. Caught just 2 passes for 19 yards, but was targeted 5 times. So you like to see that 5 target number. Not a bad total for a tight end who's really getting his first chance to make some waves. The team dealt Vernon Davis a little bit earlier in the season, opening up some playing time for him to get a look. And Garrett Selleck knocked up the last game, not really at full health. McDonald's really looked like the better tight end there. And in the last 2 games, he shined, totaling 10 receptions on 11 targets, 136 yards receiving, and a receiving touchdown in each of those games. If given the choice between Cameron Brate, Scott Chandler, and Vance McDonald, McDonald would be at the back of that pack, but he's not far behind the other 2. And Brate probably more widely available. McDonald roughly as available. Chandler probably the least available, but I don't see McDonald having a big gap in terms of production between he and Chandler. Obviously, if you're rolling with Chandler, you're probably doing so because you have more faith in Tom Brady than Blaine Gabbert. Go figure. But Gabbert and McDonald have played well together. Bears not allowing a lot of fantasy points to tight ends, but Football Outsiders not really impressed with their work against that position, ranking them just 23rd defending tight ends this year. So while the fantasy scoring hasn't been there for tight ends, I don't think this is maybe as dreadful a matchup as the fantasy scoring would suggest that it is. And on that note, that's going to wrap things up for this week's Sit 'em Start 'em podcast. Check out fantasyfootballcafe.com for all your fantasy football needs. We got podcasts, articles, and a very active forum with very excited, passionate fantasy football gamers like yourself to chat it up with. So get on there and have some conversations, or just check out the great content at the website and win yourself some contests. Try and win yourself a fantasy championship this year. Till next week, good luck.